Hey YouTube, Ethan here. Today we're going to be discussing Arbor trees in Oxygen Not Included. Arbor trees are not commonly seen in Oxygen Not Included playthroughs by many players, especially those who focus on only playing on the Terra asteroid. This is usually because by the time you get Arbor trees on the Terra asteroid, you're well enough into the game that their niche uses don't really benefit you and it's not worth the infrastructure setup, especially if your base is already well established. However, they are far more common on other asteroids. For example, if you ever plan on playing the Verdante asteroid, you're going to be confronted by arbor trees right away, and they're going to be a necessity for you to survive. In this video, we're going to go over all of the necessities that you need to know in order to get an arbor tree setup up and running. Arbor trees can be used for a lot more than just providing wood for your wood burners. You can convert them into ethanol and use them on your petroleum generators, and you can even make oxygen for your base with the byproducts. Now, there are so many different setups that we could use for arbor trees that we're not going to go over every single one. This is going to be an introduction guide into arbor trees, which means we're going to gloss over the mechanics of the arbor trees and how they work. And we'll go over some beginner-friendly designs that you can use to get your arbor tree set up and running. As usual in Oxygen Not Included, there's just so much to talk about, so we're going to try to fit everything into a reasonably sized video for an all-in-one guide to arbor trees. So let's go ahead and get right into the video. So what are arbor trees and how do they work? Arbor trees can be wild or they can be domesticated. In the wild, an arbor tree life cycle is 18 cycles, and when they're domesticated, they're 4.5 cycles. As usual, there's a trade-off between having them wild and domesticated. If an arbor tree is wild, it only needs adequate air pressure, adequate body temperature, and radiation. However, when you domesticate them, there's a trade-off to having the life cycle shortened significantly. You're going to need 10 kilograms of dirt per cycle and polluted water. For this reason, the obvious choice to plant arbor trees is the hydroponic farm. When you come across a wild arbor tree, it is perfectly fine to leave it in place and let it grow on its own. Keep in mind that you'll likely have to change the manual setting for harvesting to enable for each arbor tree that you find, as by default, they usually spawn in with harvesting disabled. So go into the harvesting menu down below and make sure you change that when you find your arbor trees. Of course, if you want to make your arbor tree production as efficient as possible, you'll want to plant them in a centralized location where your duplicants don't have to run all the way across the map in order to attend to the arbor trees. Likewise, this will make it easier in the future to implement automation in order to make the production of wood more efficient. Of course, this is very easy to do with hydroponic farms, but they do siphon a lot of resources in the form of dirt and polluted water. I definitely would recommend using the hydroponic farm to start with, but over the course of the game, if you notice that you're running into issues sustaining your water or your dirt production, you may want to switch to having your arbor trees planted by pips to keep them wild. This allows you to have many arbor trees producing wood at a lot slower rate, but without siphoning your resources. This means that you'll need about 5 arbor trees planted in the wild in order to make the production of 1 arbor tree planted domesticated. Because pips are such an integral part of growing arbor trees in the wild, but having them in a central location, we're going to briefly go over the mechanics of how to use pips. A pip is a cute little critter that's going to help you plant arbor trees, but every arbor tree that they plant will remain wild so they don't use resources. There's a way that you can use the pips mechanics to manipulate them into planting the arbor trees and other plants exactly where you want them. For this, you'll want to corral the pips into a central location, preferably a room that's about this size, or longer, depending on where your arbor trees are located and how many you want. Pips will go around looking for seeds to bury in random locations, but they can only do that on natural tiles. So if we want to centralize an arbor tree production farm, we're going to have to create the natural tiles ourselves. And there's an easy exploit that you can do using the game mechanics in order to do that. Simply build a manual airlock and surround it by 2 tiles on both sides. And then ask one of your duplicants to have it deconstructed. This manual airlock is built out of copper ore. So once Mac finishes the deconstruction, it's going to turn into a natural block of copper ore. And there it is. In a real game, you would ask your duplicants to destroy the 2 tiles next to it as well, but since I'm in sandbox mode, I'm going to destroy it myself. In order to demonstrate how Pip Planting works, I have a mod installed directly from the Steam Workshop called Pip Planting Overlay. This will highlight all natural tiles that pips can plant seeds into. As you can see, one of the pips is bringing over a seed right now, and they're going to plant it in this natural tile of copper ore. When this happens, we repeat the process by building manual airlocks in each one of these little crevices, which the pips can then plant arbor trees into. I'm going to speed this up using sandbox mode. Once I place down a few more copper ores, the pips are going to plant, and I will eventually have a row of arbor trees. The rules that pips follow for planting arbor trees are included in the mod. The one that most people have a problem with is number 1. No more than 2 other plants within 6 tiles left, 6 tiles down, 5 tiles right, and 5 tiles up from the location which you want the arbor tree planted. This means that if you want to plant a row of arbor trees that look like this, you have to start from the right and work your way to the left. You can also have the arbor trees planted slightly closer together, but I like everything looking uniform in my playthroughs, so it's really up to you. I highly recommend using this mod as it's a very lightweight mod and super easy to use. So let's take a look at what arbor trees are producing and what we're going to do with their production. Arbor trees grow branches, which then can be harvested for wood by duplicants. Unfortunately, there's no way to auto-harvest these, so duplicants will have to be here to do this task. However, once they are harvested, you can use a sweepy dock and an auto sweeper to help you collect the wood so it can be shipped and be processed. The sweepy dock is fun to use, and they're also very adorable. As you can see, this one looks over the edge to make sure he doesn't fall over. They will help collect resources in case your duplicants do not put them in the proper locations, deliver them to the sweepy dock, where the auto sweeper can then pick it up and place it into the conveyor belt. Alternatively, you could have auto sweepers throughout your production area and not rely on the sweepy dock at all. Regardless of what method you choose, we're going to send the wood into an ethanol distiller to be turned into ethanol. It is highly recommended that the ethanol distiller be automated as well, because you don't want duplicants to come here constantly to load the wood that has just been delivered here. As you can see, I have them blocked from coming in here with a mechanized airlock. I also put the mechanized airlock on a switch, just in case I want them to come back for any sort of maintenance. I can always toggle the switch, open the door, and let them come back in. The ethanol distiller will take 100 grams of wood per second and 240 watts of power, and it will output ethanol. 4 ethanol distillers is quite overkill for a farm this size. You could definitely increase the power output if you have more wild trees planted, or if you have more domesticated trees planted. I have each ethanol distiller setting their products into a liquid reservoir. This liquid reservoir acts as a buffer just in case I'm creating too much ethanol and there's no place for it to go. I don't want these machines to stop, so the liquid reservoir acts as a buffer. From there, it goes straight into a petroleum generator, which is tied onto a smart battery. This smart battery prevents the petroleum generators from working when the battery is completely full, conserving resources in the process. This is the overview of the shipping layout. It's fairly simple. I have one conveyor rail coming into a conveyor receptacle where the wood is stored, which is then picked up by the auto sweeper and placed into the ethanol distillers. And the same thing down below. The ethanol distiller will create 500 grams per second of ethanol, 333.3 grams per second of polluted dirt, carbon dioxide, and heat. As you can see, they can get quite hot, so it will be necessary to eventually cool these machines if I keep them running in the future. The petroleum generators likewise also produce a lot of carbon dioxide, so because of this, I have the optional carbon skimmer in order to take care of the carbon. These cost extra power, so they're not necessary for this setup. You could do other things with the carbon that are more cost efficient, such as feeding them to slicksters, or whatever you choose. But for this build, I have 2 carbon skimmers, which helps produce polluted water. Note that I'm only using these because I have an excessive amounts of water available to me. If you have not found a renewable water source yet, it is probably best to skip the carbon skimmer entirely until you have a renewable water source, and do something else with the carbon dioxide. Nonetheless, I have them tied to an Atmos sensor, which sends a green signal if there's above 1800 grams of carbon dioxide present. The carbon skimmer will also produce polluted water. This means I have to find a way to dispose of it. In my case, I have 2 options. I could just run the polluted water into this tank where I'm capturing the polluted water by the petroleum generators as well. But in this case, I'm sending it directly into the domesticated arbor trees to be consumed. Obviously, these pipes are backed up, so it would make more sense in a real scenario to plant more arbor trees that are domesticated in order to help use all of the polluted water that is being created, instead of having the pipes backed up. However, for this scenario, we're just using 8 arbor trees, so it is very likely that with the polluted water production, we could easily get 16, or maybe even more. This is something that you can play around with, depending on whether or not you want to use the carbon skimmer in the first place. You'll still have to do something with the polluted water that is created by the petroleum generators. And again, you could send it into a water sieve and purify it for clean water. You could feed it into thimble reeds, or domesticated arbor trees. There are many options to deal with the polluted water, so decide where your base needs it the most and build infrastructure to support that. Frankie just happened to come by to harvest this arbor tree branch, so let's take a look at how this works. As soon as the arbor tree branch is harvested by Frankie, the auto sweeper will pick it up and send it into the conveyor loader. Sweepy will also congratulate Frankie, another good reason to keep him around. Having the auto sweepers allows Frankie to get back to his tasks and other areas of the base a lot quicker. Otherwise, he would have to manually deliver all of the wood into the conveyor loader himself, or directly into the ethanol distillery if I didn't have any shipping set up. Let's get back to the ethanol distiller. The ethanol distillers create just enough ethanol in order to keep these petroleum generators running, both of them generating 2000 watts. This is an insane amount of power early on in your playthrough. So if you're starting on a new asteroid and all you have available is arbor trees, it is definitely worth pursuing setting up your infrastructure around them, based on how much power you're able to produce, with very little effort. Just keep in mind that if you are going to domesticate arbor trees, they do require dirt as well, so you have to keep an eye on your dirt production levels. The final byproduct that we haven't talked about yet from the ethanol distiller is the polluted dirt. As you saw before, I have another conveyor loader set up in the 2 ethanol distiller rooms, which are asking for polluted dirt. This polluted dirt is then taken via conveyor rail into another conveyor receptacle into a chamber filled with 3 sublimination stations. The auto sweeper handles the task of taking the polluted dirt out and feeding it into the sublimination station. Because as you can see, I have this chamber blocked off from duplicants' access as well. I don't want them wasting their time doing something that the auto sweeper can do on its own. The sublimination station essentially expedites the process at which polluted dirt creates polluted oxygen. They do require 60 watts of power each. So this is not a free method of creating polluted oxygen. However, you could simply let them off gas naturally by just dropping the polluted dirt into this room. If you have the power available, the sublimination stations can create polluted oxygen, which you can then transform into clean oxygen via deodorizers. And as you can see, I'm also using a mechanized airlock for this chamber, so the duplicants can't get in here and waste their time loading the dirt themselves. Once the polluted dirt turns into polluted oxygen, it is then filtered by deodorizers. I have a conveyor receptacle in this chamber as well, which is providing sand for the deodorizers, which the auto sweeper loads by itself. In this scenario, I'm generating the sand right beside all the infrastructure because it's sandbox mode, but you could use a similar setup where you have a conveyor loader delivering the sand from another location throughout your map. And just a reminder that you can allow manual use for the conveyor loaders, so you don't necessarily have to have an auto sweeper deliver the sand into the conveyor loader. You can allow your duplicants to feed it manually. Regardless, the sand takes care of the filtration, and the auto sweeper takes care of loading the sand into the deodorizers. Keep in mind that the deodorizers will produce clay once they've cleaned enough polluted oxygen and transformed it into regular oxygen. So I'm using a conveyor loader to deliver the clay to my kilns for ceramic production. Finally, we have to decide what to do with all this oxygen that we've just created. I'm using some standard automation here in order to deliver the oxygen into my base. I'm using an atmo sensor, which is sending a green signal if the ambient pressure is above 1000 grams. Then, I'm using a gas element sensor, which is only sending a green output if the detected gas is purely oxygen, not polluted oxygen. These two sensors send their inputs into an AND gate, which only sends a green signal once these two requirements have been both met. The green signal then goes into a second AND gate. This second AND gate's secondary green signal comes from the atmo sensor that is tied into the room where my oxygen is being deposited. For this scenario, I have created a separate room where the oxygen gets dumped into directly from the sublimination stations. The atmo sensor is right beside the high pressure gas vent, which is only sending a green signal if the surrounding atmosphere is under 4000 grams. 4000 grams is not an arbitrary number. You want to have some sort of way to stop oxygen production from overpressurizing your base so your duplicants don't have popped eardrums. So the atmo sensor is very important if you're using high pressure gas vents, because the high pressure gas vents will not overpressurize until they reach 20 kilograms of surrounding atmospheric pressure. Once that atmos sensor that's inside my base is sending a green signal, and I'm getting a green signal from my other two sensors that's tied to the AND gate, I then send a final green signal into the gas pump. This gas pump should theoretically only be able to suck up regular oxygen. The gas element sensor may still send a green signal if the polluted oxygen is not directly next to the sensor. So because of this, I have the output from the gas pump headed into a gas shutoff. The gas shutoff is controlled by a gas pipe element sensor, which only sends a green signal if it's detecting regular oxygen. If it's not detecting regular oxygen, and let's say produces oxygen passes by, it will turn the gas shutoff off and reroute the polluted oxygen back into the polluted oxygen chamber. This is essentially a failsafe to make sure that I'm only sending oxygen out from this area. Now you may have noted, I have a secondary branch where the oxygen can flow to, instead of going directly into my base. The polluted oxygen that gets filtered by the deodorizers is not necessarily going to be germ-free all the time. It is very likely to be germ-free because germs do not survive well in clean oxygen. However, they do thrive in polluted oxygen. So if you're running this setup, it is very likely that at some point you're going to have germy oxygen being produced and sent into your base. This should die off fairly quickly. As you can see in this chamber, there is almost no germs present, if any at all. And this is because germs do not thrive when surrounded by clean oxygen, but they will thrive in polluted oxygen in the form of slime lung or food poisoning germs. However, if you're the type of person that wants to take care of the germs before it gets released into your base, then you can do what I've done here. And instead of sending your oxygen directly into your base, you send it into a gas reservoir. This gas reservoir is in its own chamber filled with chlorine. Chlorine is extremely good at killing off germs, even if the oxygen is in a gas reservoir. I'm using some fairly basic automation, but essentially the purpose is to stop the oxygen inside the gas reservoir so that the chlorine has time to kill off all of the germs before it gets released into my base. Like I said, this is not 100% necessary, so if you want to do filtration of the germs, but you're not sure if it's worth it, perhaps you'll consider setting up something similar, where part of the oxygen gets diverted into a gas reservoir where the germs are killed, and the other half gets diverted into the base directly. This will help the germs inside of your base be killed off quicker, because instead of sending all of the oxygen into your base that's full of germs, you'll be sending a good portion of it into your base that is clean, which will starve the germs from being able to reproduce. Just for the record, the automation that I'm using here is a cycle sensor, which only turns on for about a quarter of the entire day. When this is sending a red signal, I'm using a NOT gate in order to allow the gas shutoff to turn on, which allows oxygen into the gas reservoir. Then the oxygen sits here, and if there's germs in it, it will be killed off by the chlorine gas. Once the cycle sensor is set to send a green signal, it will go through a filter gate of about 45 seconds, which will then open up the gas shutoff and allow the oxygen that has been cleaned from germs from the gas reservoir to head into my base. This may be overly complicated for not very much benefit, because like I said, the germs do get killed off naturally when they're in clean oxygen. The only time this really becomes a problem is if somehow polluted oxygen got into your base where your duplicants are, which allows the germs to thrive and duplicate. If you're ever wondering about the status of the germs in the polluted oxygen or your regular oxygen, you can simply click the polluted oxygen and scroll over to the Properties tab, where it will tell you the growth factors of the surface germs that are currently available. Right now, the germs are overpopulated, so 29% of the germs will be dead per cycle. There are situations where they will grow on polluted oxygen at a 300% spawn rate per cycle. This is a massive increase, and it's something that you want to avoid so your duplicants are not breathing in polluted germs. So there you have it, Arbor trees and oxygen not included, and why you should give them a try if you haven't used them before. Arbor trees are a lot of fun to use, and they can be set up in many different ways. Whether you have them wild or domesticated, they each have their unique challenges, and they're a fun way to obtain resources that will help you get through the game, especially on asteroids where arbor trees are relied upon in the starting biome. But as you can see, this is a fun technique that you can use in order to supplement the SPAWM, which can take large amounts of water to operate. The arbor trees only take an excessive amount of water if you have them domesticated. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video on arbor trees. If you did, be sure to give it a rating and leave a comment down below letting me know what you thought of it and if you're able to learn anything. Both of these things help me tremendously in the algorithm, and they help the channel grow and for new players to be able to find the same information that you just saw. Thank you guys for all your support, and I'll see you in the next one.